Hi, everyone. Welcome. So today I'm joined by Erin Tack Shipley, and we are going to be talking about Mercury and water signs as we sort of look through the lens and all the different prisms and things we can discuss in the stories that show up for us, both focusing around the third house things or water as an element. And so today talking about Mercury and water signs is one of our jumping in points for that. Erin Tack Shipley is a consulting professional astrologer, creative writer, and ritual strategist, supporting folks in staying with the challenge of being in right relationship, embracing death, and co creating culture within and beyond systems of oppression. Weaving astrology with other tools as well, Erin helps people reconcile the gap between how they are in the reality of their present conditions, who they perceive themselves to be in their ideal world. Erin lives, works, and tends community on the traditional lands of the Awaswas, Cotoni, Uypi, Sayanta, and Aptos speaking peoples. Erin, is there anything else that you would like to say to sort of introduce yourself or to let us know how you're showing up today before we dive in?
Oh, thanks for that introduction and thanks for having me here. I don't know that I have anything to add to the introduction so much as I just never realized how much Mercury is in my bio. I was listening to it like, wow, there are so many things that relate to Mercury in there. And I often, my natal Mercury is combust in Pisces. And so it has a way of like hiding, but being very present at the same time. And so it was just like nice to listen to it from that lens and perspective. Yeah.
I love that. And feels perfect for how we're showing up. So today we're talking about Mercury and water signs. And so I appreciate you sort of joining me in that experimental topic and theme. And so, sort of the general flow for how we're going to do today is we're going to sort of talk about Mercury in general. We'll talk about Mercury in water, and then we'll go through some of Mercury in the water signs in all three of them with some examples and some thoughts about how we think or how we perceive Mercury to be showing up in those waters. Um,
Awesome.
yeah, do you want to just like dive right into just like I'm like it always feels so big, like Mercury in general.
Yeah.
Thinking, yeah, what are your sort of opening thoughts for how we engage with or understand Mercury?
I always like to start with stories because
Mm,
I feel like I'm a storyteller. And what better way to start with a story than a birth story? So, Mercury is the son of Maya and Zeus, and the the legend goes that on the first day of his birth, when he was like still a wee babe in a cradle, he actually snuck out of his cradle and stole the oxen of his brother Apollo. So like he started his like thievery and conniving from a wee lad, and he snuck back into his actually okay so the myth in detail is that he slew two of the oxen, and content warning for those listening, especially vegans. He what's it called when you like he like tanned the oxen that he slew, and he like nailed the skins to like a boulder or a rock, and then the rest of the oxen were like hidden in a cave. Um, and then he found a tortoise shell, and he used the sinews of the slain oxen to make the strings of the very first lyre. So he's a day old and he's making a lyre, which is, for those who don't know, an instrument, a musical instrument of ancient Greece, very often associated with Orpheus, who we could talk about later. But so he makes this lyre. From what I understand of this myth, of like nailing the skins to the boulder, this was like the very first ritual, and so he's sort of like the creator of sacrifice.
mm,
from like a very young age. Anyway, Apollo discovers that his oxen have been stolen, and he's justifiably pissed off. Can I swear on this podcast?
Absolutely.
How do you feel about
Yeah.
that? Okay, great.
Great about it.
And he goes to sort of figure out who did it. He knows that it's Mercury because Apollo sees everything. Apollo's the sun, and he goes and sort of interrogates Maya. And Maya's like, "Here's the baby in the cradle," and like nobody's buying it. So Apollo goes to Zeus, and Zeus is Mercury's father, and Zeus is telling Mercury, like, you have to give your brother his oxen back. And Mercury's like trying to trick his way out of it, and it doesn't work. And he realizes that it's not working. And so he takes Apollo to the cave to show him where the oxen are. And Apollo sees that there's 2 oxen that are missing, and he's upset. But then Mercury brings or hands Apollo the lyre. And Apollo is so like enchanted by the lyre that he like forgives Mercury and lets him keep the oxen. And they become friends as well as brothers for whatever the rest of eternity. And I think it's such a like rich myth in terms of understanding what Mercury is about, because Mercury travels with the sun always. It's the planet that never gets too far away from the sun. It's always like a little bit up to something. It seems to work out for him. Mm-hmm. He's a creator of various crafts, rituals. There's an element of trade that goes on here. Like he ends up trading the lyre for the oxen, even if maybe that was Mercury's intention. People are quite a bit smitten with him as a child. He's like, oh, he's so smart. Mm-hmm. Even though he's like stealing shit. Mm-hmm. So there's like quite a bit of charm there. Mm-hmm. In what arises, and the lyre goes on to become this instrument that like tricks demons and helps, like Orpheus plays the lyre for Persephone and Hades, or Persephone and Pluto. Is it Proserpina and Pluto and Hades and Persephone? Or is it? I think that's right. When he's trying to retrieve Eurydice from the underworld. And so there's all of these like ways that the lyre becomes this instrument of charm and trickery. And it sort of also leads us into Mercury's association with psychopomps and death, which I think is like maybe something that we could talk about in a moment. But yeah, I love the way that Mercury appears to make things out of nothing, but it becomes like a very important element of each story, whatever this thing is that's sort of crafted out of thin air or out of what's available. So there's something about like making do. And I think we would be remiss to not talk about trickster figures and the ways that trickster figures have also been like supports to folks who are subject to systems of oppression. Kristen Mathis speaks about Mercury's talent with words and voice, and how Mercury as a god is like an ally to forced laborers, people who maybe don't have or haven't had control over their environment or their bodies, but the one thing that they do have is their mind and their words. I could go on, but I'm going to just leave it there for the moment.
No, I think that's the perfect way to open. I feel like the things that really stood out to me from what you said are just sort of this association of Mercury with like craftiness, but also like
Mm-hmm.
craftsmanship. Um, like there's no for Mercury, there's no like morality over like appearing this way in this situation and then appearing this way in another situation. That's not like, ooh, you're lying. It's just very much that shapeshiftery nature in order to get what one wants.
Mm-hmm.
um, it has sort of that like con artist vibe to it to me where it's like I'm going to trick you into wanting this thing that you didn't know that you wanted, that actually I stole something from you, but you're going to thank me by the time we're over. Like that's such a like, yeah, that crafty con artist kind of trickery sort of way, in such an archetypal way. And they really, it does end up sort of like being a gift. You're like, thank you for stealing my oxen, like I love it, thank you for this instrument. It's such an interesting, it's such a funny little twist. And so many ways that story is already pointing out the sort of like dual nature of Mercury, this like duplicitousness of Mercury, like things that sometimes in our um, ways that we can be like over prudish and deciding like, oh no, you must be like consistent and the same all the time, and that's like better or like
Mm-hmm.
quote more moral or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Mercury is just a lot more playful than that. Like I feel like Mercury is very much the like video game messenger who's like reminding us of like the game of reality a little bit, like
Mm-hmm.
that we're taking reality like seriously in so many other ways. And Mercury's like, remember, it's all a game and you can play the game and like you just gotta learn to play. And that's sort of
Yeah.
like a very mercurial medicine, I feel like.
Yeah. It also reminds me of how, like, lying is something that we've decided is like incorrect or immoral. It's so interesting to me that Mercury is um, son of Zeus or Jupiter, which is a god that is often associated with truth, and is the
Mhm.
brother of Apollo, the sun, which is also associated with truth. But then Mercury is this sort of like winged messenger, but like under their wing, and is
Mhm.
this like trickster god that is sent to um as a herald, like is the one who is sent to communicate and delegate and what's the word, I have Mercury in Pisces, so everybody listening will just have to bear with me while I like reach through my like mental dictionary. um yeah, who is Mercury is sent as the messenger to deliberate and find peace accords,
Mhm.
or achieve peace accords rather. uh that's still not the right word, but it's fine.
Yeah, but I think you're pointing to something really important. Like it's also a way too where it's like, it's easy to be the god of truth when you have someone else on the ground doing your dirty work, Like it's easy to be
Right.
like on the high ground when actually someone else is the one delivering the message and their one
Right.
job is to make them happy with whatever it is that you said. Like you don't know how they're like bending or forming in order to so that you can just be this like god of truth or whatever.
And I think Mercury is also often determining which truths are important and which ones are not.
For
And
sure.
like there are certain things that are like, well, it's not important for you to know this.
Mhm.
And like morally, on from a sort of larger zoomed out perspective, withholding truth or twisting the truth or bending the truth or um, uh, replacing the truth with something else, the detail with a different detail, isn't immoral, especially if we're thinking about Mercury as like ally to forced laborers, as an example. And I'm using that those words because it's directly taken from Kristen Mathis's translation of the Orphic hymn to Hermes.
Mhm.
Hermes and Mercury are the Greek and Roman names for the same god. But there's this, like, I think a lot about how many people are subject to capitalism or exploitation of one sort or another. And like lying or bending the truth are ways that they protect, not just protect themselves, but like achieve, harness, uh, reach for resources that they would otherwise not have. And is it really immoral? It's like, um, it's like Robin Hood, stealing from the
Mhm.
rich and giving to the poor, or like the person who is punished for stealing a loaf of bread, but well, what is the larger system that isn't ensuring that his family has something to eat?
Mm-hmm.
And is it really wrong to steal and to lie in those scenarios?
Exactly.
Like, morality is subjective.
For sure.
And very often determined by the people who hold the most power. And Mercury's job is to sort of shift and sneak through the cracks and redistribute, organize, allocate, reallocate power in ways such that not just a few individuals are holding it.
For sure. It's like whoever, it's like that phrase, like he who has the gold makes the rules.
Mm-hmm.
um and Mercury just interesting and subverting that in a way through trickery, and use the word sneakiness, which I really, really liked. Always here for a Robin Hood story. I remember I grew up in a very like conservative Christian background, very black and white thinking, very right and wrong, and that's just kind of what I was grown up in. And I remember watching The Sound of Music because I was obsessed with musicals at a pretty young age. And in the movie, towards the end, the like Christopher Plummer's character like lies to sort of like get his family out. I was like, well, isn't lying like bad? And it was sort of like my first sort of encounter with just like sort of moral gray areas. And I remember feeling excited about it, but not yet at an intellectual age or religious freedom enough to really process that. And just sort of, yeah, who's making the rules and who decided that, what is what you're saying in service of, and that sort of subversive covertness of Mercury, which really ultimately gives Mercury a lot of freedom, like the ability to like not belonging to any particular sect. Like I can belong to the day or to the night. I can belong to the above world or the below world. And I fly around. So of course I have to be responsive to like the changes in wind and weather, and kind of constantly assessing who I need to be and what I need to be in order to get where I'm going and not fall, etc. And I think that's an interesting quality, and something that at least someone like me, or the upbringing like mine, was sort of taught to look down on those skills. And now I'm like, we need these skills. Like they're magician skills, really, in a lot of ways, especially yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's reminding me of a story that I feel like I've heard a teacher of mine tell a number of times. Many people listening might know of Bayo Akomolafe. You're familiar with him? He is, I think, one of the most Jupiterian and Mercurial, intuitive, intelligent, thought leaders of our time. That aside, he speaks often of, or at least used to speak often of, the time when colonizers were invading Africa and creating the slave trade, and how they were Christians who had gone in and were colonizing folks with Christianity, and the people indigenous to the lands didn't have a devil.
Exactly.
It just like didn't exist in their cosmology. And so the Christians just like picked a god of theirs, and they were like, this is your devil. And the god was Eshu, who was a trickster figure. And when Bayo talks about Eshu, I just can't stop thinking about Mercury, and how this god who like really like slips through, is sort of shamanic in many ways, or it slips through cracks, is like a companion and a guide through initiatory journeys, is quite a powerful ally to the folks who were being colonized. Or at least that's the way Bayo speaks of it. And it's interesting to me too because of Mercury's connection or like role as psychopomp. So in at least in the Orphic tradition, I've been studying with Kristen Mathis and Drew Levanti. Anybody who's like really into astrology and has not signed up to be a supporter of Kristen Mathis's Substack, you should just like stop listening to this podcast and go do that right now. Just like read everything she's written because she's amazing. But what was I saying? Classic Mercury and Pisces problems.
You were kind of bouncing off of Eshu being sort of...
Oh, psychopomp.
Yep.
Yeah. So Mercury in the Orphic tradition is the god that guides the dead down to the underworld to meet their fate, so to speak, in front of Pluto and Persephone. And so when they get to Pluto and Persephone, they're supposed to deliver like a password. They're supposed to remember a password. And the password is something akin to like, I am a child of earth and starry sky. The stars and heavens are my family. Mm-hmm. Like something really like beautiful and reminds us of our like inherent belongingness in the cosmos. Mm-hmm. And Mercury is their company who takes them down into the underworld. And like, I think it depends on how you interpret Orphism, and it's so hard to say because I think in some traditions, especially the Egyptian tradition, the ultimate goal was to like join the immortal ones, which were the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set below the horizon. And the Egyptians thought that the stars that did set, that like heliacally set and rose before after or before the sun, like heliacal setting stars are stars that are setting after the sun sets. And that's what we would call like an evening star. And stars that are heliacally rising are rising before the sun rises in the east in the morning. And those stars will heliacally rise and set throughout the year. So those stars were understood as the ones that like walked upon the earth with the mortals, and they would be perceived as like, when they're heliacally setting, they're coming to walk upon the earth with mortals for a while. And then when they heliacally rise, they're like returning to the realm of the immortal ones. The circumpolar stars never set. And so in certain traditions, it was understood that when a person died, they were going to the underworld and sort of like vying for their place among the immortal ones. Mm-hmm. And then I think the Orphics actually were just like down to be incarnate and maybe would want to join the immortal ones, but they were really just like, guide me along my path where I'm supposed to be, help me remember what I'm supposed to remember, and whatever I'm not, I will like come back and like reincarnate as like another human doing this whole thing again. But let Mercury help me remember.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to, you know, in a lot of traditions, it's just like there's something about forgetfulness that's embedded into our experience of being human. And in all of these epic journeys that we make, like throughout our lives or throughout our initiatory moments, or even in the initiation of death, there's this invitation to like remember. And it's a really important, and a lot of what we're remembering, even thinking about like Mercury again, is sort of our dual nature of like being the star and being the human, of being the above and the below. It's sort of reconciling or reckoning with what we share with Mercury, which is sort of the riddle of remembering, that we are two things, that we are both things.
Yeah. And it's interesting in the Orphic tradition too, there's 87 Orphic hymns. Mm-hmm. There's 2 hymns to Mercury. Mm-hmm. And one of them is to like the Mercury that we know and love, hopefully. that is like most common. And then the other one is to chthonic Mercury, chthonic meaning like below the earth. And that's the hymn to the Mercury that is guiding us to the underworld, which I think is really interesting to consider in the context of Mercury and water signs, especially because that hymn opens with speaking about like the river of wailing and like going down to like Cocytus or something. So there, this idea of like the river where we choose like which stream or which current to swim amidst, and Mercury helping us choose feels very watery to me.
For sure. And it even just makes me, the rivers that like the river that is a part of the underworld, and sort of crossing the river is a big part of your initiation into that world. And, the waters that move like down underground below the mountains and then back up again, this like that fluid quality, is something that though Mercury doesn't rule a water sign or exalt in a water sign per se, there is still that quality of fluidness that belongs to both water and to Mercury that I think is really well kind of shown in what you're sharing there.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is I, in preparation for this recording, I just looked up what happens to Mercury, like when you mix it with water. And you can go like look up a YouTube video, and there's a ton online. But if you like put the element Mercury in water, they won't mix. Mercury will actually settle to the bottom of the water.
Wow.
And it doesn't like make a big splash when you like drop it in the water, but if you mix it up, it will like move like fairly quickly, but it stays separate, which I thought was so interesting because Mercury doesn't have rulership over any of the water signs, but somehow like still moves very quickly. And I really like this idea of Mercury as like a chthonic messenger, someone who can sort of, I don't know, if we think about water as like emotions or unconscious or subconscious, like the ability to quickly descend all the way to the bottom of the unconscious or all the way to the bottom of the feelings and be looking up at them from like a totally different perspective, and to not have any piece of oneself pulled away, or even to like maybe split. Like there's definitely like Mercury bubbles that like split when you stick a spoon in the water and mix it up, but they will continue to like travel to stick back together. Like Mercury will come back to itself. And I thought that was so wild to be like watching the way that the element interacts with water and stays like sort of holds on to its ability to separate and organize and perceive and like be without becoming, which makes sense when we're thinking about Mercury as like guide to the dead. Like Mercury guides the dead to the underworld, but then returns back to the upper world, maybe with a different being, but like really, sort of travels on its own, is never like stuck there with another being.
Yeah, like doesn't themselves die in the process.
Right. So just like thinking about what it means to be like a psychopomp in water, or to have an emotional death, or to be witness to an emotional death, to have the capacity for emotional depth, to be like emotionally active as well as mentally active, or as opposed to mentally active. Because I think Mercury is a very like mental function, as a guides mental functions as the planet, but there is something about, I feel like I've heard a lot of people say something about how Mercury in water signs can mean that it's hard to distinguish feelings and thoughts. And just watching that video really made me question that concept and whether they're just easily, like they go easily together, but they stay separate.
Yeah. And I think, in thinking about Mercury and Pisces in particular, which we can jump in a little bit, but like, the way that we think, like sort of Mercury considered sort of muted in water signs, and really kind of sitting with, like, doesn't mean that Mercury can't function. It just means that Mercury is functioning differently. And in the signs that Mercury rules and exalts, we're thinking about, we live in a very mercurial world, I think, in my opinion, at this time, where we have sort of the avatars of self and technology, and we live in a very commercial economy, a very transactional economy. And like there's data and content and algorithm, like it's all everywhere. And sort of when we put Mercury in a water sign, it's like suddenly they're prioritizing something else, or they're better at doing something else, which culturally we're like, well, that's not helpful. Like, is Mercury in Pisces going to help be your accountant and like Marie Kondo your closet and like organize your TikTok content? And like, probably not. It doesn't mean though that what Mercury in these signs is doing isn't important. It's just like having something that's not stereotypically like what we would consider like the high function or the most mercurial function. It's like, yeah, maybe they aren't prioritizing sanding the perfect chair or making money or transacting the most content or getting to 1 million followers on Instagram, but they're prioritizing something else. It doesn't mean they don't know something. It doesn't mean they don't speak language. It just means that like that language is getting subverted or submerged, I guess we could say, into something that's prioritizing or interested in something else, which I tend to have a preference for anyways. So
Yeah. Oh God, my brain is going in like so many different directions. I'm thinking about the myth of Mercury and the giant Argos. Who was a sleeping giant who had like 1,000 eyes and never kept all of his eyes closed at once. And Mercury, when I think about like a sleeping giant with many eyes, I'm like, oh, it's like the ocean that we swim in, right? It's like capitalism, right? It's like literally the larger body of like oppressive systems. And Mercury was sent to rescue Io from the giant. And the way that he slew the giant was he played the lyre and put the giant to sleep. And it was so simple. The way that he slew the giant was just like, oh, I'm just going to be sort of magical and creative. Which reminds me of that quote from like Tony Cade Bambera that is at the beginning of, I think it's Pleasure Activism, of like the way that something about the way that we like sort of engage the revolution is to make the revolution irresistible.
Yeah.
And this idea of Argo as like the Argo is the eighth house. The Argos is the Greek's word for the eighth house. And it represents this ship, like Jason and the Argonauts sailed on the ship, the Argo. And the Argo used to be this boat. It used to be a constellation in the sky. It was like the largest constellation in the sky. And at some point it was split into 3 separate constellations. But in Greek, Argos also means a pause. And a lot of this, I learned from Kristen Mathis. She's like an important teacher of mine. But there's this, it means like a pause, like the dead wind. or like the moment where somebody dies and loses their breath. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that like Mercury slaying this giant is like the first thing it does is it creates the pause, but it creates the pause by making music.
Exactly. I love that. I feel like those are really beautiful associations. And I think I'm trying to decide if I just immediately jump into whales or not. But basically, like, I was like, do I just go there? Okay, great. Sounds like everybody who has listened to this podcast for any length of time will know that I'm obsessed with whales. And not to get too deep into my personal cosmology, these huge creatures that are literally like singing and reverberating around the whole blue planet that is ours. And like, we can't hear them directly from where we're sitting, but like, I'm personally at this point convinced that like whatever we think are like intuitive hits that we're getting is just picking up what the whales are throwing down. Like, they're just literally like singing these grids like all over the world with their like migration patterns, and their listening and their family. Like, it's mind, and it's on purpose. Mm-hmm. It's also very intentional, just watching their moves and how they're like, how do I expand this sound as far out as much as possible? And like just sort of like what in a lot of ways is sort of a hidden nature of that, but also something that's so powerful and taking up a lot of sound space and like wave space, energetic space, like on our planet. And that's sort of where I'm pinging with that when you were like with music, which is the background that's all around us on this planet that maybe we're hearing, maybe we're not, but there's that.
Yeah. It's interesting too. You're talking about whales, and I think about Jupiter when I think about whales. Sure. I think because of Jupiter's dominion over Pisces and the bigness of Jupiter and the bigness of whales. And Mercury feels much more like a dolphin to me for some reason. I think because Mercury is like the kid, right? And is like a little bit playful and trickstery. Not that whales aren't trickstery, but they're trickstery in different ways. And it makes sense to me, even Mercury being a son of Jupiter. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that their domicile signs are opposed to one another, but they're not, but they are of the same thing. Exactly. They are of how we think. Mm-hmm. And they don't dislike each other necessarily. Like, I mean, Jupiter, I think, is very often amused by Mercury. And I think Mercury likes sort of amusing Jupiter, if you will. And I'm a huge fan of Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And so for those who aren't watching the video, when Grace started talking about whales, I like held up my borrowed copy of Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And there's a passage in, I think it's the 3rd chapter on remembering, where she's talking about this pod of dolphins and singing, and how the mothers sing to their young when they're still in the womb, and the entire pod for like a few weeks is just quiet. Mm-hmm. So that the mother can teach the child while still in the womb their name. I like almost started bawling.
Which is a song. Just FYI. It's a song.
It's a song. And it's like but it's like the whole pod has to shift. Like the whole environment has to shift for this child to learn its name, and the whole community gathers together to do so, to make this happen. Mm-hmm. And I think there is something about Mercury in a water sign that is like acutely aware of the way that the environment which holds us, not the container, but like the environment, the atmosphere, and how that changes our experience of what we learn, what we retain, what we remember, how we interact. And so I think like Mercury in water signs is like, okay, so Mercury is the dolphin, Jupiter's the whale. Mercury knows that it's not big enough to like fight the whale. So what it will do is it will influence the environment to get the whale's attention or draw the whale's attention in some other way. I mean, I don't know about the relationships between dolphins and whales. So like this is all like pure metaphorical theory right now, but it's designed to help people understand how I think Mercury in water signs operates is very much attuning to the environment and tuning the environment.
Yeah.
Much like a musical instrument, to change the way that it's experienced by anybody within it.
I would agree with that. I feel like that was sort of where it was like going in my mind when you were talking. Just the way that it's like Mercury in the water sign, it's like not the, it's like what is the vessel or the vehicle for like getting this communication across? It's not the blog post with like the perfectly outlined like headings and the right amount of like characters that are going to suit the algorithm. The auto post is going to, it's not that one. It's more like, how do we encode this thing? How do we like hide it maybe even like behind a myth or in a song or in a vibration so that only the people who are listening in can sort of get it, you know, or hide it in a children's story or hide it in a poem or a sci-fi novel or a fantasy poem or whatever. So, or like the Orphic hymn, like it's hiding behind something that just can tune you, whether you understand it in the sort of earth side mercurial way or not.
Yeah. It's like it's hiding in plain sight.
Exactly.
But not always. I don't know. I like Mercury's association with caves. I mean, so many
And the
planets.
riddles and like the puzzles and
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree.
Very tricky.
Yeah, exactly. Very like, and sort of bringing out that sort of chthonic, shapeshiftery, even sort of hermetic, shamanic, even roles of Mercury, where they're, yeah, there's a way that they stay sort of hidden. Like the occulted things they're pulled back, they're hidden, and there's a reason for that. And all these little drops of tricks and waves or dolphin songs, etc.
Yeah.
Sort of help you get there.
It's also interesting to think about how like, yeah, I'm thinking about that video again of like dropping the element Mercury into water, and Mercury moves very quickly in water. I don't think Mercury loses its speed in water, but it does probably adapt its speed to the it adapts its speed to whatever is influencing the water. It doesn't adapt its speed to the water. Like you have to mix, like there has to be a force that is stronger than both the Mercury and the water to shift it, because Mercury is so dense that it will, like if it's just Mercury and water, Mercury just drops to the bottom really fast. But once it's there, it stays still, which feels very Mercury and Scorpio to me.
Yeah, it does. Yes.
Unless shifted. Mercury and Scorpio is like on the bottom of the water looking up at everyone else. Like...
holding it down. Like I'm already here. For sure. Yes, for sure. And I'm also like two random things that are sort of popping up for me before I think we may dive into some more sign specific things are in some traditions, like dolphins and whales are bridge beings. They're sort of like humans are sort of interstellar between earthly and stellar, and which I think makes sense based on what we're talking about. And the other thing is, I completely forgot. Oh, no, navigating in the ocean. We don't really have like landmarks, which are sort of the normal way that we would navigate or have a map or this thing. It's like we start looking up, like you're saying. I mean, we're like, we use the stars to sort of like know where we are. And just that way of that navigating. And also, I think the vulnerability to like the ground underneath you shifting at all times, and being able to like adapt to that in a really swift manner is really important. So, do you feel like you're ready to? Do you want to dive into some more sign specific things? Is there anything else that you want to say on the general table before we, or do you feel like they'll sort of come out naturally?
I think there are actually a couple of things on the general table of just like Mercury in general. I can't believe I never put this together until like recently when a friend pointed it out to me. But like Mercury and merchant and mercantile, those words come, they all come from Mercury.
Commercial.
So there is Mercury, the tradesman, Mercury, the attender of commerce. We've sort of touched on it in myriad ways, but Mercury has more like crafts or trades or jobs, so to speak, than any other planet. When you look up the associations with different trades, whether the trade is being like a priest or being a salesman or being a weaver or being, whatever it is, like Mercury can sort of slip into many, many roles. So the adaptability piece is very important. It rules 2 mutable signs, just like Jupiter. And we spoke about it a little bit, but Mercury is the herald. So Mercury's a liar, and yet he's the one that all of the gods trust to go communicate their ideas to others. And very often over time, Mercury's staff was changed. So I think people will see the staff with the 2 snakes that are weaving around each other as the staff of Mercury, and they'll associate Mercury with snakes. And I understand the sort of slithery aspect of snakes and Mercury, and also like the Mercury slaying Argos, the dragon, as like potentially a snake. And there's some constellation associations as well that I won't go into right now. That said, that imagery is not the original imagery of Mercury's staff. Mercury's caduceus was much more like a wand. It was shorter, and it had it has like a circle, and then like a little half circle, and open. It's like an open infinity sign. And actually, if you look at it with the wand piece, it looks like the symbol for Mercury. With the circle and then the like half moon. And that wand is very similar to, if not is the same wand that the heralds would bring when they were like negotiating peace accords in ancient Greece from like city-states. And they were fairly democratic as a nation. I know that there were these like yarn like tassels that were often like strung around the caduceus, but just wanted to mention that Mercury, more than anything, I think is a negotiator. Messenger and negotiator. And when you put those 2 things together and apply them to almost anything that we as humans do on Earth, it involves Mercury. Whether you're like interpreting and negotiating, or whether you're interpreting divine texts and delivering them as like a prophet to the people, or negotiating like bread for coin. can go many, many ways.
Yeah, that's sort of like, the way that we associate Mercury with things like, like education and language and translation, and I think even like patterning. You mentioned weaving earlier, and like handy, like all these different ways that it's different than like the Jupiterian way of like making meaning, but there's still a very like creative way to sort of how do we like find, cook, and digest information and knowledge, whether that's through crafting a ritual or crafting a quilt or making a table or an arithmetic or whatever the thing, or a library. I think all the different ways that shows up, and a lot of the times that Mercury is interested in bringing them into sort of the middle of the town square, right? Like whether that's through the commercial world, or developing like merchandise or something that is more behind the scenes, more like occulted, hermetic things, all of which are words that kind of come from the root word of Mercury themselves.
Yeah. It's like, I feel like Jupiter is like a culture maker and Mercury is like a culture doer. Or a culture shape. Like Jupiter's like a culture maker and Mercury's like a culture shaper.
Yeah, it's like it's sort of like Jupiter's like making meta out of whatever stuff that Mercury has created, and Jupiter sort of surveying the top of it from the mountain and being like, it appears that the meta of all of these little things is this. Whereas Mercury is just more interested in like making it, I think.
Yeah.
Or being involved. It's just sort of a perspective that I've noticed. Mercury's like, look, we made a library and we wrote a bunch of books, and Jupiter's like, what does it mean that we have a library? And so yeah. Anything else you feel like you want to say on the general table?
I don't think so. I mean, it's always so much, but
there's always so much.
So many ideas, so little time.
There's exactly. I feel like every time I do an episode like this, I'm like, then this could be a series. So there's that. Which water sign do you feel like diving into first?
Oh, I feel like we could start with Mercury in Cancer because it's cardinal.
Let's do it.
And because Mercury's so often like, I think the significations of Mercury and the moon, which rules Cancer, are very often conflated, and there's definitely similarities and overlap. So I wouldn't totally deny that.
Yeah. What are your, I feel like a lot of the ways that they intersect is their proximity and their size, and also their changing nature and their speed are things that they share in common. What are the things that you would like to bring forward about that?
Well, I think about Thoth, the Egyptian god of art, and death, kind of. And Thoth was like a lunar god, but also was like connected to Mercury. And I also just taught a course on the third house where the moon gets its joy, and so we were delving into a lot of lunar myths. And Akati was the last lunar goddess that we spoke on, and there's so much overlap between Akati and Mercury. There's actually even like a couple of like short threads of them as lovers, though I don't know how like accurate that is. But I do think that there's overlap or ways that they're the same god, because Akati is like a goddess of the crossroads who also was like a company to the dead, and Mercury being the psychopomp and the guide to the dead. So they're both of them coming in the hour and moment of death to accompany the soul to the underworld. Also, they are both ministers, that's a good enough word, to Persephone. Mercury is a minister to Persephone. I think Akati is more like a priestess or a maiden to Persephone. So Akati accompanies Persephone to the underworld and becomes her friend after she witnesses her abduction. And Mercury is seen as like a minister to Persephone because he guides the dead to her and helps them remember. So there's so much overlap there. And it's also interesting to me, Mercury doesn't have triplicity in water. Like if we're talking about the various ways that planets can have dignity, Mercury doesn't have dignity of any sort really in water signs, except if we look at the decans, there's two different ways that we can determine planetary decans. One of them is by triplicity. So obviously Mercury doesn't have a decan in any of the water signs according to triplicity. But in the Chaldean order, Mercury has, I believe it's the second decan of Cancer. And it doesn't have any decans in Scorpio or Pisces in the Chaldean order. So really the one place where I think Mercury does have like a little bit of sway, a little bit more sway or a little bit more ease would be the sign of Cancer. And I think some of that has to do with its similarities with the moon, and maybe like finds that the resources available in the sign of the moon are similar to the resources that Mercury might choose for itself or might oversee for itself. And I do think there's something about, like, even though Mercury is mutable, the cardinal nature of Cancer, the ability to shape, the ability to initiate, I think is probably amusing or fun for Mercury to harness. I also think that Mercury is often seen as the company of the sun. And we even see that in the myth of Mercury's birth and his connection to Apollo. But Mercury is of neither or both sects. A sect, S-E-C-T-S, just to be clear for anyone listening. It is of the diurnal or the nocturnal sect, depending on its solar phase, and sometimes the sect of the chart, depending on the author. So in that sense, I feel like chthonic Mercury or like nocturnal Mercury enjoys the company or the environment of the moon. Yeah.
A lot of times when I'm thinking of Cancer, I'm thinking of sort of like the void, or that sort of meta womb space, which, and you're sort of like bringing up sort of these like chthonic myths and stories, and just how like death is a birth, and how the sort of the relationship of those things, like kind of passing through the ocean or the great void or etc., feels also like a very unifying and maybe shared goals or shared interests potentially in that environment.
Yeah, even like where the tides meet the shore and the moon ruling the tides, and this idea of like thresholds or crossroads. Like it's a very it's very much a psychopomp. It gets to be a psychopomp in Cancer. And I don't think that while I understand Scorpio's associations with death, and maybe even Pisces associations with death, though I don't associate Pisces with death personally, I do think that it is most like akin to the waters of Cancer as somebody who likes to cross thresholds, or is like designed to cross those thresholds and to be a little bit trickstery. And I think there is something even about like the crab that like maneuvers itself through the cracks, or the holes in the sand, feels very Mercury to me. The shapeshifter. Moon's a shapeshifter. Mercury's a shapeshifter.
Yeah.
So there's even changing speed.
Yep.
But I do think that Mercury can be like a little bit emotionally swayed. If we're talking about the way that water, the way like Mercury, the element in water, and like how the water needs to be mixed up with enough force to be swayed, or to like cause ripples in the Mercury itself, or to move the Mercury itself from the bottom of the water. Otherwise the water's just floating on top of the Mercury. The pull of the moon, the gravitational pull of the moon and the tides, to me seem like a strong enough force to do that.
I think that's true. Yeah. And even in the sort of the tempestuous nature of the ocean as well, I think kind of suits someone who is prone to shape-shifting. And I think it's really great. I think there's a way that we can think about a lot of times Mercury in water signs or Mercury with the moon, just having like more emotional ways of speaking or communicating, or I can't remember if you shared this while we were recording or before we were recording, but that sort of like having access to knowledge that maybe didn't come from the classroom or the teacher or the book, and how those can be sort of like superpowers potentially that we can find with Mercury in water, even though they don't fit into some of the more standard containers that we normally associate with Mercury's sort of earthly duties.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's also interesting that Mercury, like when Mercury's with the sun, it's very often any planet that's within a certain number of degrees of the sun, but not cazimi, is considered combust, and so it gets burnt. But Mercury is not burnt by the moon.
Exactly.
But it has the regality of being like luminous, or like a luminary. And like Mercury is like pretty shiny as a planet. It's like shiny and sparkly and like, you know, quicksilver. And so I think it absorbs that quality in Cancer, that sort of luminous quality. And I was looking up people with Mercury in Cancer. Like Elon Musk has Mercury in Cancer.
Oh, weird. I would not have seen that coming.
Yeah, I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense to me. That's sort of like tricky, and like he's a funny one too. Like I mean, obviously not a huge fan. That said, he's not
He's
not
sort of
as
hard
easy
to categorize. Like he's hard to
Yeah.
pin down.
Yeah, I wouldn't categorize him the way that I would categorize other like other corporate dictators.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And some of the ways that he makes decisions, you're sort of like, wow, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah. And they're like strangely, some things are like strangely progressive. I'm not saying progressive positive, I'm just saying progressive, exactly. To be clear. Yeah, like exactly. Unexpected, didn't see that coming. There's something very, and yet they're very regal. So that's one example. Carl Jung has Mercury in Cancer.
Like that makes sense to me.
Which is just like, okay, I see there is something very that idea of like knowledge that comes from experience that wasn't handed down by others, but maybe it was like handed down by spirit, or comes from the underworld, comes from the deep unconscious.
Exactly.
Like Jung was like the master of that.
For sure.
And obviously we're not looking at the rest of their charts, and so I wouldn't say that Mercury in Cancer is like particularly prominent. I don't think in any of
it's
these.
not like solely responsible for any of these things that we're discussing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like in Carl Jung's chart, it's in the 6th house. It's like closely conjunct Venus, though, which is kind of nice. And in Elon Musk's chart, it is. Hang on, I'm just pulling this up here. In Elon Musk's chart, it's in its own decan in the Chaldean order, and it's in the 10th house with the sun. So that's not nothing. So that's an interesting one. And then the last one that I found, which I think is like so lovely, and is Sylvia Rivera. Do you know Sylvia Rivera? Who is a trans sister, who created a home for queer and trans youth who were sort of exiled from their homes in New York, and I think was at the original Stonewall riots, and is like a really powerful activist, but activist in the way that I think, at least what I know about Sylvia Rivera, seems much more geared towards, it's less about rebelling against the world that we live in and more about creating a world that she wanted to live in. And this idea of Cancer being ruled by the moon, and the moon being like the original Kurotrophos, which is the caretaker, caregiver of children, and the moon being somebody who is like a midwife, so to speak, both in myth and in reality. To me feels like I could cry. Like I have a knot in my throat just like talking about Sylvia Rivera. Yeah, feels very like a very positive connection to Mercury in the sign of Cancer, as somebody who is able to like shape the environment to create an environment that is welcoming and loving and affirming of all of the children. Mercury being like a symbol of children and of youth.
And also queerness.
And queerness. Mercury's like the OG queer. OG ungendered, or all the genders.
Exactly. Yeah, it's perfect. I love that example, especially it's just a very queer mom home nurturing. It's a really beautiful blend of sort of the significations of both of those, both the environment and the planet, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you say we move to, should we kind of keep going cardinal, fixed, mutable? Does that feel a good flow?
Yeah, I will just, I kind of want to, can I read like an excerpt from Undrowned?
Oh yeah, please.
Because this feels like, so there's the beginning of the 3rd chapter, Remember. And I really do like, I think memory is so important to like Mercury and the moon, like recalling things. And I think that has to do with like Mercury and Akati, and like bringing the dead down to Persephone to like remember who they are. But there's the beginning of this chapter on remembering, Alexis Pauline Gumbs is talking about this dolphin, which is the only marine mammal that the dominant scientific community calls by their indigenous name. And I don't actually know how to pronounce it. It's spelled Tuxici, I believe. Is it? I can't find it in here. Yeah, Tuxici, sorry. Named in the Tupi language. But she says, it's a miracle we say her name. This is my prayer. May anyone who seeks to mention you be called to learn the language of those who first loved you. May you study the pink of yourself. Know yourself riverine and coast. May you taste the fresh and the salt water of yourself and know what only you can know. May you live in the mouth of the river, meeting place of the tides. May all blessings flow through you. I love you, impossible dolphin, quietest in the river, breathing close to the surface. I'm grateful for what you remember, even if you never say. And I'm keeping your name in my mouth, like a river internal, like this love ever flowing. I am keeping your name in my mouth every day, all day.
I love that.
Yeah. And I like thinking about the mouth as a womb for the thing that the idea that we're like getting ready to birth.
Yeah. Thinking of the magical nature of Mercury as well, just in the relationship between words and ritual and spell and incantations and songs and things like that. Feels very powerful.
Yeah. Thanks.
No, thank you for reading that. I feel like Undrowned is the perfect water Bible.
Yeah. It's like if anybody wanted to, they could just not listen to this episode and go read that book and like, yeah, just read Undrowned and like you'll understand Mercury and the water signs.
Exactly. I agree. That's so true. Just kind of shifting personalities, I feel like a little bit, like Mercury and Scorpios, maybe definitely some contrasting feels, I think, to Mercury in Cancer. Mercury and Scorpio would be ruled by Mars, and so sort of a big change there would be, instead of being ruled by a luminary ruled by a traditional malefic, it has a more like fixed nature as opposed to that more tidal nature that we associate with Cancer and with the ocean. And so already with just those associations, we have a little bit of we have a big change in scenery, I feel like, and an interest in functionality, perhaps.
Yeah.
What are some of your sort of intro thoughts to Mercury and Scorpio?
Yeah, I think my addendum would be that for all of the differences, there are also similarities because Mars is of the nocturnal sect. And so it belongs to the moon's kingdom, so to speak. And as much as Mars is like a warrior and a fighter, it's also a protector in the ways that I think Moon is a protector. And the myths that I associate most with Scorpio are myths of Artemis, who is a lunar goddess and a warrior. And so I think some of the qualities are like retained. Again, it's the idea of like understanding the environment and influencing the environment. But I think Mercury is more reserved in Scorpio in the sense that I think it influences the environment with its silence and with what it conserves and retains and withholds. Like, again, this idea of there's a difference between lying, like supplying a replacement truth, versus withholding truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Mercury in Scorpio is much more a withholder of information. It's tactful in that it waits for the right moment to release information when it's being skillful. Like a scorpion, when it is hunting, like never misses its prey.
Mm-hmm.
But if a scorpion is backed into a corner and threatened, it will sting everything chaotically until it's accidentally, most often, kills itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Mercury in Scorpio, peregrine, so it's not dignified or undignified necessarily, but I do think it has like a sharp edge.
Yeah.
That it wields with some degree of grace. And I think there's so much that is communicated with silence, whether it is communicating protection of oneself or protection of another, or protection of information, or even like protecting another from one's own rage is like one thing that I think can happen with Mercury and Scorpio. Yeah, there's almost a stoicism about it that reads, yeah. I guess I'm also thinking about like Mars as like training for war and like building muscles.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not it's definitely enduring. I think there's like the people who I've had conflict with who have Mercury and Scorpio, they can go forever, man. They can process for like a long time. Yeah. And they can process like the emotional realm and look at things from like every angle. And I think that really speaks to like the density of Mercury, like settling on the bottom surface of the water and looking up at the water from the other side. So like settling to the bottom of the deep unconscious and looking up, it really is like Mercury, super nocturnal, sort of in the underworld. I'm like Mercury at the bottom of the river Styx.
Yeah, I think there's a capacity for the deep and the dark
that
Mercury and Scorpio has, and I agree with that sort of. A lot of times I think of Mercury and Scorpio alongside this image of like the crime investigative journalist or whatever. Like there's like the map in the background of like all the papers and the pictures and the red dots like of yarn, like connecting one person to the other. And like the journalist hasn't slept in like weeks and they're buried under a pile of books and it's like, and like the matter itself might be something like a little violent and like ick or sharp, and being strategic about what they let people know that they know or what they don't let people know that they know. But there's in this attraction to sort of what is under wraps, like what is hidden, but then also hiding things themselves, whether there's a clear motive for that or not, but just like, sort of this orientation towards keeping things private.
It's like penetrative allure.
For sure.
Of the mystery. It's like very, mystery feels important.
Mystery feels right. Yeah, it feels like they're a place where it could differ from it doesn't have like that nurturing quality. I think that it's like, I feel like Mercury and Scorpio, does have that sharp quality, and maybe like accidentally offending people with like sort of the sharpness or the abruptness or the it's like something that I see in my own life and other Mercury and Scorpio. They're like, oh, I thought I was making a joke, but it came out like too harsh or like too strong or slanted in a way, and people like, oh, that wasn't funny. Like it was too dark or something.
Yeah, it's like misread.
For sure. So
it's like, it's not necessarily a miscommunication, but it can be like the way that something is communicated and the way that something lands, or the way that something is intended and the way that it's received, there's like a gap between.
For sure. Things that are perceived as conflict when they're like not meant that way, which I think could be sort of that martial mask over the interaction.
Yeah. I think a lot of the people that I know who have Mercury and Scorpio also seem to, like, people seem to be uneasy around them. It's just like there's something like mildly intimidating. And like, to be fair, I also have a lot of people in my life who have like malefic ruled ascendants. So they could be Scorpio rising, they could be Capricorn rising. And so it might not be the Mercury that's the intimidating factor, but I do think that there is something about, yeah, it's like the sharp edge, but you don't really, it's like being careful. You're being careful around somebody who's a master wielding a knife, like a well-sharpened knife.
Yeah. Something that came, sort of a situation that came up. I was thinking of like roasts, where the people just like stand up with a mic and just like ruthlessly make fun of somebody in the audience, like as it's, I guess, like it's a form of comedy or whatever. And that feels very Mercury, Scorpio. It's like very like, there's like no, has a very low bullshit meter, I guess. And it's just immediate, like it's like making a joke or a trick or whatever, but it's like harsh and you're a little bit like, oh, it was also like a punch in the face at the same time. Feels like a very Mercury, Scorpio just situation in general.
Yeah. Makes a good comedian though, if you're like,
it does.
If you like dark humor.
For sure. That sort of sarcastic, skeptical, incisive edge, I think.
Yeah.
For sure.
But I do think it's interesting because there's these like ancient statues, like there were more statues of Mercury than like any other god, and like more myths with Mercury than any other god. But these statues called herms were placed like everywhere in ancient Greece, and they were basically like, they were kind of two-dimensional except for the penis. And people would like rub it for good luck.
That's amazing. Oh my god.
And yeah, they had like obviously a very different relationship to sexuality, but I am thinking about this sort of like the very phallic Mercury, and like Mercury as a gymnast or lover of gymnastics, and like, watching other men, and like BDE, like Mercury and Scorpio is like BDE. Because Scorpio is penetrative, right? Yep. Like Mars is penetrative. So there's a, all sexual innuendos definitely present here. But there is something about that very primal. It's like the teenagers who are flirting by teasing the person with whom they find infatuation, and are like maybe a little harsh, and it like the other like sort of softy teenager with raging hormones, Mercury and Cancer, like can't tell if they like them or not, and like,
for sure,
runs
like,
home crying.
Are you kidding me? I was like, I like you. Like, what? Yeah, exactly.
Like that.
Like that. Yeah, that feels very true. I think also of like just a lot of like swearing or curse words, etc. Mercury and Scorpio as well, just sort of like cursing from a very young age, that feeling very like a very like natural kind of swagger or way of speaking that doesn't probably feel like much to like in the situation, but for some people who may have like a more gentler nature or whatever, they're like, oh, that's like, it feels like so harsh or like so much or so rough, I guess. Whereas to like the Mercury and Scorpio experience, it doesn't feel that way. Yeah.
I mean, I think also Mars is like association with death.
Yeah.
Mars burns things.
Yeah.
slashes, it's gory, it's and then Mercury as the psychopomp again. So we have the one that kills and the one that accompanies those who are killed.
Yeah. I can't, maybe it's just the book that I'm reading now, but I tend to like love like shows or stories or whatever that are like that sort of like 1990s Yakuza era Tokyo.
Mm.
And it's just all that sort of like there's a lot that kind of like goes into that vibe. Like there is this sort of this like underworld of like death and like underwater crime and like commercial extortion and like spy, like that sort of thing. It feels very like red light crime and things like that. It just feels very Mercury, Scorpio. That sort of transgressive quality, I think, is what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah.
Which I think,
And even a little chaotic. Like,
oh,
I'm thinking about
definitely.
Jessica Jones now and
Oh,
how
what?
she's like a raging. Have you watched Jessica Jones?
No.
It's one of the Marvel
Oh,
um,
great. Okay.
series. She's like a raging alcoholic and also a crime fighter, superhero,
Mm-hmm.
and like a private investigator. And that's
Mm-hmm.
like very Mercury and Scorpio.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I think that word transgressive is really hitting for me. I
Yeah.
think, yeah. It's like sin, right? Like it's that sort of like the dirty world
Yeah.
behavior or the
Doing someone's dirty work.
doing
Yeah.
someone's dirty work.
Yeah. Mercury and Scorpio will like do the dirty work. But it's interesting to me because so many people who I know have Mercury and Scorpio also have hecka Libra placements because
For
Mercury
sure.
never travels too far from the sun, or hecka Sag placements. And
So there's
there
some cuddlier
is,
personas potentially.
yeah, well, the people who I know with Mercury and Scorpio who have a lot of like Libra placements, I think are more like, uh, I think they're a little bit more cutting and almost, I don't know if mischievous is the right word. Cunning, I think, is a really good word. It's like the very skilled lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
like the expert litigator
Mm-hmm.
would be somebody with like Sun, Venus in Libra, but Mercury in Scorpio. Whereas like Sun, Venus and Sag with Mercury and Scorpio is like, that's more mischievous, more
Mm-hmm.
like there to have a good time. Like maybe the Mercury operates in a way that's like a little bit more chaotic,
Yeah.
but like chaotic good, like the jab and then the laugh that follows.
For sure.
Uh, whereas the Libra placements have like there's like that sort of alluring social grace, whereas the Sag stuff is much more of the swagger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for sure. Yeah, that Mercury and Scorpio having that potentially like a gravitas with it, or like that endurance to get to the bottom of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I saw that a couple of examples that I found that I thought Winston Churchill has a Mercury in Scorpio,
Mm.
which someone who's like we think of being like very quotable,
Yeah.
succinct, but also most notably remembered for their like wartime communication.
Mm-hmm.
Um, feels very Mercury and Scorpio. Also, some poets like thinking of like William Blake and Arthur Rimbaud and Rainer Maria Rilke.
Interesting.
Um,
Oh,
People who sort of
Rilke.
like swim in these like deep, dark, kind of
Yeah.
mystical waters, especially thinking of like Rimbaud, particularly.
Well, Rilke has an entire like series on sonnets to Orpheus too.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
like mystery cults
Yeah.
are um not abandoned there.
They're not off the table. Very much on the table. Yeah. Were there any fun examples that you noted?
I didn't really look for them. I think because I have so few Mercury and Cancers, I was just like trying to get a sense of like ideas for Mercury and Cancer, whereas I have so many Scorpio Mercuries and Pisces Mercuries in my life that I was like, I feel like
Got that.
I know these I know these placements.
For sure. Um, Is there anything else you want to say before we hit Mercury and Pisces?
I think just the denseness of Scorpio, or of Mercury, feels really important in Scorpio. Like the denseness of the element. And I wouldn't call Mercury and Scorpio dense, like stupid. That's not what I mean at all. More the solid quality of Mercury feels like it really shows through in Scorpio. Like it's sturdy.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can. I think it also can stay in the cave. Like Mercury's association with caves.
Yeah, probably needs to be in the cave.
Yeah, Mercury slaying the giant.
Yes.
In the Corinthian cave feels very like. I would just suggest that for people who have Mercury in Scorpio, is like giving yourself cave time.
For sure.
Whatever that means to you.
Yeah. It's like the cave is the only thing that will allow for the amount of focus and obsession needed to get to the root of the things that you're interested in.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. I think that's great advice. Mercury and Pisces on a more jovial note.
Sometimes it feels jovial. Mostly it just feels confusing.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm natal Mercury and Pisces combust. So like, yeah. Doesn't get more.
I can't remember who said it, but it's stuck in my mind that Mercury and Pisces is thinking about the entire universe all the time. And I was like,
yeah, that's pretty accurate. I think Diana Rose Harper, who's like a dear friend and colleague of mine, posted something like a thread recently on the planets in fall. Mm-hmm. And she like gave a description of each planet in fall, and the one for Mercury really struck me. It was something about like trying to articulate the magnitude of God, mm-hmm. all the while knowing it's an impossible task. Mm-hmm. And, you know, setting yourself up to try to do it anyway, because that's the only thing that you can do. And that feels very Mercury and Pisces to me. And so sometimes I definitely feel like, at least from personal experience, the thing that I'm trying to communicate never gets across all the way. And it's like, that makes sense. You know, God isn't crossing the river Styx.
Yep.
The entire cosmos, the whole all, not there. It just is the all. It is the sort of the black abyss of spirit.
Yeah, and it's, you know, like language, there are things around which language has to expand in order to even begin to talk about them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times sort of our average way of communicating, we find is lacking these sort mm-hmm. of ineffable, indescribable experiences, mystical experiences, all of things which we find in Pisces pretty regularly.
Yeah, and I think anytime we're talking about a planet in fall, we're also talking about, we're not talking about a planet that doesn't have power. Planets in detriment, actually, I think have less power than planets in fall. Though technically Mercury is also in detriment.
For sure. I was like,
yeah. Both and, which is hilarious because it's Mercury. But I do think that there's something about once you understand the power, you can harness it. But it's hard to understand the power when you're in an environment that is totally antithetical to what you're like meant to do. And we speak often of Mercury as verbal communication. Mm-hmm. And there's so much nonverbal communication that goes along with Mercury, because Mercury is the passageway, the channel, the communication itself, and the communicator, the messenger. And I think what Mercury in Pisces picks up on is not just nonverbal communication, but like actual spirit communication. Yep. Like the current it's the current and the ocean, and the like what you were talking about of like the whale songs or the sonar that like echo and reverberate for miles and miles and miles. It's like the symphony underlying or overlying or subsuming everything. And I think Mercury in Pisces sometimes, at least in a very tangible way, can get caught up in something that it's picking up on that might be perceived as coming from like an individual, and that might be true. And there's also like all of the like premonition capacities or like notes or tones that come through for Mercury and Pisces, but it's hard to place the root of where the communication is coming from, and so it can get like stuck or confused. I think Mercury in Pisces struggles to edit or to like get to the root of something or get to the end of a thread, and so it needs a lot of like acceptance and tolerance for the fact that the spool of thread is infinite.
Yeah, I think that, you know, a lot of times I think with the water signs in general, but in Pisces in particular, it's like, you know, if you're going to communicate underwater, you don't like send someone a book, right? Like the book, like the ink's going to run, the book's going to get soggy, it's going to fall apart. Like there's no way that that way of translating and communication like even makes sense there. But like what is like you're saying, the sonar, the sound, the songs, even like the even all of the instruments and have to be completely different in order for communication to happen there.
Yeah. And I think Mercury likes to work. I think Mercury often likes to work on its own.
Yeah.
Like with others and communication with others, but it likes to kind of do its own thing. And Mercury in Pisces, I think does function best as psychopomp, which is interesting because it's in a Jupiter ruled sign, and Jupiter to me is not a psychopomp. But if you look at the chthonic hymn to Mercury, and maybe also I know I have the chthonic one pulled up here. Yeah, it talks about like necessity's path, or her twirled cord, and necessity is the daughter of Aphrodite. Aphrodite is like the all, the whole all. Again, I will just credit Kristen Mathis for these ideas, or understandings rather. But necessity is, if Aphrodite is the force which compels things together, necessity is the force which pushes things apart, which separates them. Necessity is connected to the fates, maybe considered the mother of the fates. And so then there's the three fates. There's the one that spools the thread, or like makes the thread. There's the one that weaves the thread, and then there's the fate that cuts the cord. And when Mercury as psychopomp is leading the dead down to Persephone, he's sort of leading them down to their fate, right? It's the companion to along necessity's path, that on necessity's path of no return is part of the hymn to chthonic Hermes. And I think that requires Hermes to have, or Mercury rather, to have a very I want to say a wide lens, but like that doesn't even really encompass what I'm trying to get to, because it's a cosmic lens of what's happening. And I think that's Mercury in Pisces. It's like it's the cosmic understanding that just like cannot be encapsulated in any of the like fractal realities that the Greeks understood the world to have. It's happening in everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is a great, I use that for Pisces in general a lot of the time. And just thinking about, a lot of our daytime earthly mercurial functions are like, what time is it? And being on time and the schedules and organizing the things. And Pisces is like, there is no time. Like it's made up, this like the conversation doesn't even like translate. But then even like when I was looking for examples of Mercury's in Pisces, it was Copernicus and Galileo both had Mercury in Pisces, and the Radon ratings are like either double A or A.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of that cosmic lens of just like kind of always looking up and out and just sort
Mm.
of taking stock of our place in it all.
Yeah, it's like the captain of the Argo, the captain of the ship, who's yeah. It's, I mean, Mercury in a Jupiter ruled sign, Jupiter being the the father of, well, I guess Saturn's really the father of all, but Jupiter being Mercury's father, and Jupiter being the god of the Olympians. And this, like, Mercury in Pisces has access to Jupiter's resources.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, like, how do I put it? In one sense, Mercury is under the constant dominion or gaze of his father, which is not Mercury's favorite place to be. But in the other sense, Mercury has all of Daddy's resources.
Exactly. It's like
and
the
Daddy
price one
rules
must
everything.
pay. Exactly. The price one must pay. To
Yeah.
have the
So
keys to
it's
the
like,
kingdom.
yeah. And yeah, Mercury in Pisces feels very, very much like the kid who maybe the lucky rich kid who has the keys to their parents' Beamer for the weekend. Just like a kind of a horrible metaphor, but what will you do with it?
Yeah, I'm also thinking too of sort of this Jupiterian role of like the priest. I feel like just thinking about like, you know, sort of like the priest, the poems, the prayers, like the things that we, the places we find ourselves, the ways that we attempt to communicate with that which seems greater than us or we can't see, and sort of the different kinds of rituals or formulas or perspectives, ways that we try to translate those things. And when people have like tend to have these sort of like what I would normally associate with Pisces, these sort of like really mystical experiences that usually like can really change someone's life, and they're like, I can't really explain it, like they can't quite, it doesn't translate to words, like you just had to be there, or like I can't really tell you what happened, I just know I'm different, or this is different. And I think that quality too feels very Mercury in Pisces as well.
Yeah, it's like synchronicity is not easily accessed vicariously.
Exactly.
It's something that must be experienced, like the feeling of elation, of buoyancy that happens when understandings align is like something that you can embody, that can like pass through you, but it's difficult to relay. Like, I can't count how many times I tried to tell somebody about it, an experience of synchronicity, and nobody had the revelatory reaction that I had when it happened.
Yeah.
So there's that. But I do think that people have the revelatory reaction when they read a poem or experience a song, or like read a story and put different pieces together. Like, I don't know, Da Vinci Code, or I think Tolkien is like actually maybe a better example. Like, and I haven't read all of the Lord of the Rings. I was 4 when my dad tried to read me The Hobbit and was traumatized by like all of the like demonic creatures in it, and we didn't even get through the full book. And so I never had the relationship with Lord of the Rings that so many of my peers and colleagues have. But I do understand the feeling of what was being communicated there.
Mm-hmm.
There's like the magical undercurrents of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
of the world, and the love for the earth. There's an enchanting quality to Mercury in Pisces, which to me is like, that's Orpheus, right? Orpheus and the lyre. Mercury created the lyre, Orpheus perfected it. And so there's the did you say it was Rilke? Rilke has Mercury in Scorpio, not Mercury in Pisces. Yeah, but there's something about like creating an image or a visual for people to like fall into. Feels like trance states, altered reality, like the ability to alter reality for others, to like influence the environment in such a way. Like when you go to the movies and it's like, yeah, virtual reality feels like a Mercury and Pisces thing. But when you go to the movies and you feel like you like forget that you're alive as you're watching the movie, you feel like you're in the movie. That feels like Mercury and Pisces to me.
Yeah, like through these devices or these technologies, even of fantasy and imagination and virtual reality, even like how they're sort of their own technologies, their own modes and modalities of communication, even though they're not as linear or language based.
It's because the world's so big, and Mercury in a Jupiter ruled sign is in like a worldly space.
Yeah.
A cosmic space, like you said, like, you know, Galileo and Copernicus, just like looking up at the sky.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Are there any other examples of Mercury and Pisces people that you wanted to bring forward?
You know, I bet you, I don't know, do I have her chart here? I was going to say, I bet you Claire Boucher, probably. Grimes, who is Elon Musk's baby daddy. Let me see here in my files. Samples. Here's a good one. Lady Gaga has Mercury and Jupiter in Pisces.
Yeah, I saw that one, which makes sense in a lot of ways. Just very larger than life shows with elephants. You know, it's very present.
World building.
I think I think Justin Timberlake has Mercury in Pisces. Johnny Cash has Mercury in Pisces.
So many musicians.
A lot of musicians. Maya Angelou is a great example of Mercury in Pisces. I think it's also very close to Venus, exalted Venus in Pisces as well, which makes sense for her. Yeah, lots of
Abraham Lincoln is Mercury in Pisces.
I don't remember the Rodin rating on that one, but I saw that one. A lot of like thinking outside the box, because Pisces is like, there is no box. So
the box does not exist.
The box does not exist. And so just a lot of out of the box thinking.
Yeah, but I also think about Mercury like building the lyre, and I'm like, well, the box doesn't exist. But Mercury in Pisces is like, okay, well, I'm going to make the box then.
And the box is made of music.
Yeah, even like I'm thinking about those little music boxes that I used to see as a kid. I was so enchanted by, and sometimes like they'd have like a ballerina that was like spinning, but I think the most beautiful ones were like jewelry boxes. My mom had this little jewelry box that I loved that had like a mirror in the bottom, and it was like stained glass. And you opened it and it would play this like Russian lullaby. And it had like, I don't know if you remember, it had what looks like a spool of thread that has these little notches coming out of it. And it would like sort of prick the chords. That's like Mercury and Pisces. It's like a whole world of sound in this tiny little thing.
Code.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there is there anything else that you want to say about Mercury in Pisces, Mercury in general, before we lean towards wrapping ourselves up today?
I think Mercury gets a bad rap because there's so much focus on Mercury's conniving nature.
Mm-hmm.
And we never stop to think about why Mercury's conniving, what for. And Mercury, more than any other god, like when I was, I have this book, classic bestseller, Mythology, Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes by Edith Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
When I was looking at the glossary, the index for Hermes, one of the things that it said was like, it says, see also Mercury. Apollo receives lyre from, Ares freed from prison by, Argus slain by, Argus being a demon, brings Persephone from underworld, Calypso ordered to free Odysseus by, father of Pan, father of Silenus, we'll skip this, messenger of the gods, rescued from Circe by, aided by, rescued by, brought from dead by, sent as messenger to. Mercury's a helper.
Yeah, busy bee.
Mercury's an assistant. Mercury's an aid. And not an aid without agency. And Mercury gets reduced a lot to being conniving and trickstery. And most of the time when Mercury's playing a trick, it's for the sake of helping or healing or rescuing or supporting or accompanying or witnessing or solving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we could just give Mercury a little bit more moral credit,
Mm-hmm.
even if Mercury doesn't care about morals, because that's not Mercury's domain.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a reason that Mercury is, simultaneously pissing everyone off and helping everyone out.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think when I think about that in terms of water and the pollution that is like rampant in our waters and our oceans, I think that Mercury in a water sign is a real lifesaver. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I think something that's really landing for me is refusing to follow the rules.
Mm-hmm.
Is a Mercury quality that I really admire, and I think Mercury and water just having the additionally subversive nature of going underground, going underwater, speaking a different language, communicating in a different way through the magic and the myth and the poem and the prayers and the ineffable. And those are all things, the music, the whales, the dolphins, etc., that are I think things that I feel very drawn to, and they feel very medicinal in this time. So
it's beautiful.
Before we from two water Mercuries out into the world, these are our thoughts. What would you like to leave our listeners with as far as where they can find you on the internet? This episode will come out in October, so if you have any, where can people get in touch with you? Where can they take a class or a course? Anything that you have coming up that you would like listeners to know about?
The best way to find me is my website. It's ET, like extraterrestrial, ET Shipley, SHIPLEY.com. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. I send out Mercury and Pisces missives every once in a while. And I'm at ET Shipley on Instagram and on Threads. I'm very Mercury and Pisces about social media these days. I have some things in the works potentially for October, but nothing's confirmed yet. So I'll just keep that under wraps. The best way to find out about it is to find me on the interwebs. And I open my books usually at the end or beginning of each month for the following month. So if you want to get a session with me, the best way to do that is to sign up for my newsletter. And I do have a couple of courses available on Podia. Probably the one that I would most direct people to was a lecture that I gave on the third and sixth houses on care work and disability justice in 2020. So I think the website for that is like podia.etshipley.com or something. But by the time this comes out, there should be links available on my website to access those. Yeah. And I will likely in the next 6 months or so be launching a new cohort of my course Temple Medis, which is about the third house. And maybe we'll talk more about that sometime in the future.
For sure. Well, thank you for coming on and for swimming around in this mercurial pool.
My pleasure. I love splashing.